The iron ring felt cold and heavy on Leanne's finger, a coarse circle of metal for a coarse new life. It was the cheapest sort of ring, the kind a man might buy for a key, not a wife. From the corner of the stifling Justice of the Peace's office in Redemption Creek, Nevada, the whispers of the townswomen were as sharp as sand in the wind. Look at her. Doesn't even speak the language. Vance must have been desperate. Paid for her passage, I heard. A mail-order bride from China. What's a man like that want with one of them? Leanne kept her eyes fixed on a crack in the dusty floorboards, her face a still, silent mask. The white prairie dress she wore, a gift from the agent in San Francisco, felt like a costume for a play she did not understand. It was clean and simple, but on her it marked her as foreign, an object of curiosity and scorn. This was not the golden mountain her family had imagined when they'd accepted the proposal. This was a parched, dusty gulch of humiliation. The man standing beside her, her new husband, did nothing to stop the whispers. His name was Arthur Vance. He was a tall man, made of long, quiet lines. His clothes were worn but clean, his face weathered by a sun that had baked all softness from his skin. He had said fewer than 20 words to her since she'd stepped off the stagecoach an hour ago. He had simply nodded, paid the justice, and guided her to the front of the room with a light but firm touch on her elbow. He did not look at the people who mocked him, nor did he look at her. His gaze was fixed on the far wall, as if he were looking straight through it to some distant horizon only he could see. When the justice grunted that the deed was done, Arthur placed $2 silver on the desk. He turned to Leanne, his expression unreadable. "We'll go now," he said, the words low and flat. He led her out into the blinding summer sun. The town of Redemption Creek was little more than a single dusty street lined with clapboard buildings whose paint had been scoured away by the elements. A few horses stood hitched to rails, their heads drooping in the oppressive heat. Everyone who had been inside the office now spilled out onto the boardwalk, their eyes following the strange couple. Arthur's wagon was waiting. It was old, the wood gray and splintered. The wheels were thick with the mud of 100 journeys. Harnessed to it was a single horse, a magnificent black stallion whose coat shone like polished jet, a stark contrast to the decrepit wagon it was tied to. The horse was the only fine thing about Arthur Vance's entire presentation. He helped her onto the hard wooden seat, his hand briefly brushing hers. His palm was calloused and dry. He climbed up beside her, took the leather reins, and with a soft click of his tongue, set the wagon in motion. They rode out of town without a backward glance. The whispers followed them until the creak of the wagon wheels and the plodding of the horses' hooves were the only sounds left. Leanne sat straight and still, her hands folded in the lap of her white dress, a solitary, silent bride being driven into an unknown wilderness by a man who was a stranger to her and a joke to everyone else. The heat was a physical weight pressing down on her, and the road ahead was nothing but a shimmering ribbon of dust stretching into the empty expanse of the desert. She did not yet know that the humiliation in the town was the first and last toll she would have to pay for the life that was waiting for her. The silence in the wagon was absolute, a space filled with everything that had not been said. Arthur Vance kept his eyes on the road, his jaw set, driving them away from the world of men and into the heart of his own private country. For the first few hours the landscape was unchanging. Sagebrush and dry grasses stretched to every horizon, the sky a vast empty bowl of blue. The sun beat down relentlessly, and the dust kicked up by the horse and wagon coated Leanne's dress in a fine brown powder. Arthur had not spoken another word since they left town. He drove with a quiet economy of motion, his hands steady on the reins, his gaze sweeping the terrain ahead. Leanne watched him from the corner of her eye. He was not what she had expected, but then she hadn't known what to expect. The matchmaker had shown her a daguerreotype of a serious-looking man with kind eyes, standing before a small, neat cabin. The man beside her was harder, leaner. His eyes narrowed against the glare, holding a watchfulness she couldn't decipher. He seemed poor, as the townspeople had whispered. His wagon was old, his clothes were patched, and he had paid the justice with a couple of silver coins. Her family had used their last savings to send her here, hoping for a better life. A cold knot of fear tightened in her stomach. Had they sent her to a life of even greater poverty than the one she'd left behind? But there was the horse. Nero, he'd called him once. A soft murmur when he'd adjusted the harness. The animal was powerful, well fed, its coat brushed to a high sheen. A poor man did not own such a horse. A poor man's horse would be as worn as his wagon. It was a contradiction, a detail that didn't fit the story the town told about him. As the afternoon wore on, the flat land began to rise. They entered a landscape of rolling hills dotted with juniper and pine. The air grew cooler, carrying the clean scent of resin. Arthur guided the wagon off the main track and onto a smaller, less traveled path that wound its way up into the mountains. The creak of the wheels was now joined by the sigh of the wind through the tall trees. The world was turning green and shadowed. They traveled for another hour before the sound of rushing water reached them. It grew louder and louder until they emerged from the trees into a clearing on the bank of a wide, churning river. It was not a gentle creek. The water, swollen with snowmelt from the higher peaks, moved with a formidable power, its surface broken by white-capped rapids and the dark shapes of submerged rocks. There was no bridge. Leanne's breath caught in her throat. They could not cross that. The current was too strong. It would sweep the wagon away as if it were a child's toy. Arthur pulled the wagon to a halt. He sat for a long moment, studying the water, his eyes tracking the flow, mapping a path through the chaos. He seemed untroubled. He set the brake, wrapped the reins, and jumped down. "Stay here," he said. It was not a request. He walked to the river's edge, his boots sinking into the soft earth. He waded in up to his knees, testing the force of the current, his body braced against its pull. Leanne watched, her hands twisting in her lap. This was madness. He would drown them both. After several minutes, he returned to the wagon. He looked up at her, and for the first time his eyes seemed to see her, not just the space she occupied. "It will be rough," he said, his voice even. "Hold on. Tight." He checked the harness on the horse, speaking to the animal in a low, soothing murmur. Nero's ears twitched, but he stood steady, trusting the man. Arthur then went to the back of the wagon and retrieved a long, thick pole of hickory wood. He secured it to the side of the wagon bed before climbing back onto the seat. He took up the reins. "Ready, Nero?" he said softly, and urged the horse forward, into the water. The cold shock of the river enveloped the wheels. The wagon lurched as it left the solid ground of the bank. The current immediately seized them, pushing, trying to drag them downstream. Nero strained against the weight of the water in the wagon, his powerful muscles bunching. Arthur's hands on the reins were a study in control. He didn't fight the river's main force, but angled them slightly, using its power to help guide them toward a shallower section he must have spotted from the bank. Leanne gripped the edge of the wooden seat, her knuckles white. Water swirled around her feet, soaking the hem of her dress. She could feel the immense, relentless pressure of the river against the wagon, a living thing trying to tear them apart. Halfway across, disaster struck. A front wheel slammed into a submerged boulder with a sickening crunch. The wagon jolted violently, tilting at a dangerous angle. Leanne cried out, thrown against Arthur's side. The horse whinnied, a high, sharp sound of panic, and fought against the reins, trying to rear in the deep water. The wagon groaned, threatening to tip over and spill them all into the torrent. In that moment of chaos, Arthur Vance was transformed. The The quiet, watchful man became a figure of absolute command. He did not shout. He held the panicked horse with an iron will, his voice a constant calming rumble that cut through the roar of the water. "Easy, Nero. Easy, boy. I have you." To Leanne, without taking his eyes off the horse, he said, "Hold to me." She did, grabbing his arm. It was as hard as stone. With his free hand, he unwedged the hickory pole. Leaning far out over the tilting side of the wagon, he braced himself against the seat and plunged the pole deep into the riverbed, seeking purchase. He found it. Using the pole as a lever, he put his entire weight and strength into the effort, his muscles straining against the immense force of the water. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. The wagon hung balanced between stability and destruction. Then, with a great groaning sound of stressed wood, the wheel lifted and scraped free of the rock. The wagon righted itself with a jarring slam. Arthur immediately dropped the pole and took control of the horse again, guiding the frightened animal through the rest of the crossing. Minutes later, which had felt like an eternity, the wagon wheels found purchase on the far bank, and Nero pulled them out of the river, dripping and shaking, but safe. Arthur brought them to a stop in a sun-drenched meadow. He set the brake and sat for a moment, his chest rising and falling with deep breaths. He turned and looked back at the raging river, a formidable barrier between where they were and the world they had left behind. "That's the last we'll see of them," he said, the words quiet but final. "No one from Redemption Creek has the nerve to cross the Carson River." He wasn't speaking to her, but to the memory of the town, dismissing it completely. Then he turned his gaze to her. His face was still unsmiling, but the hardness in his eyes had softened, replaced by a quiet assessment. He had seen her fear, but he had also seen that she had not screamed or panicked. She had held on, just as he had told her to. He climbed down from the wagon and came around to her side. He simply stood there, offering his hand. After a moment's hesitation, she placed her hand in his and let him help her down to the soft grass of the meadow. Her legs were trembling. The white dress was soaked and stained with river mud. She was a wreck, but she was alive. And for the first time, she looked at the silent man beside her and felt not fear, but a flicker of something else, a reluctant, grudging respect. He built a small fire, his movements efficient and practiced. While their clothes steamed dry in the afternoon sun, he offered her a canteen of fresh water and a piece of dried meat. She accepted both, her hunger suddenly sharp. They ate in their customary silence, but it felt different now. The shared danger of the river had forged a fragile connection between them, a wordless understanding. When they were ready, they started again, the wagon climbing higher into the mountains. The forest grew thicker here, ancient pines and firs forming a dense canopy that dappled the path in shifting light. The air was cool and clean. The world of Redemption Creek, with its dust and its judgment, felt a world away. It was as if the river had washed it clean from their lives. As they traveled, the silence between them finally broke. It was Arthur who spoke first. "My name," he said, speaking slowly and clearly as if to a child, "is Arthur." He tapped his own chest. Then he gestured toward her. "You are Leanne." She nodded, surprised he had remembered her name from the brief ceremony. "Leanne," she repeated softly, the sound of her own name strange in this vast wilderness. He seemed to take this as an encouragement. He didn't ask her questions she couldn't answer. Instead, he began to speak about the world around them. He pointed out a hawk circling high above. He named the trees they passed. He talked about his horse Nero, how he had raised him from a colt. His voice was a low, steady rumble, and while Leanne understood only a fraction of the words, she understood the tone. He was not speaking to fill the silence, but to share his world with her. He reached into the inner pocket of his worn coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was not a letter, but a legal document, its edges soft with wear. A deed. He carefully unfolded it on his knee. It was a hand-drawn map of a vast parcel of land, hundreds of acres, showing mountains, a river, and wide swaths of forest. He tapped a spot near the center of the map. "Here," he said, his voice holding a note of something she hadn't heard before. Pride. Home. He fell silent for a time, his eyes on the trail ahead, as if gathering his thoughts. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, more serious. "The folks in town," he began, "they think a man's worth is what he shows them. A fancy hat, a silver buckle. They measure you by the dust you kick up." He gave a small, humorless shake of his head. "I prefer a life with less dust." He turned to look at her, his gaze direct and searching. "My father left me this land. He also left me trouble. Men who believed what he had belonged to them. After he died, I left. I let them think I had nothing, that I'd disappeared. I let the world forget me. It was safer that way." The pieces began to click into place for Leanne. The fine horse and the worn wagon, the quiet confidence, the complete indifference to the town's opinion. "I needed a wife," he continued, his voice softening. "I wanted a partner. Not someone who wanted the land or the money I was hiding from. I wanted someone who would see the man and agree to marry him, even if he looked like he had nothing." He looked down at his calloused hands on the reins. "The agent in San Francisco said you were a good woman, from a good family, that you were brave." He paused. "I had to be sure. The man in the letter, the man with the neat cabin, that was a lie to bring you here. But the man with the old wagon, the man they laughed at in town, that was the test. To see if you would come with me, when I had nothing to offer but my word." Leanne stared at him, her heart pounding. The humiliation in town, the whispers, the cheap iron ring, it hadn't been for her. It had been a crucible for him, a way to find someone true. He had subjected himself to the town's scorn just as much as he had subjected her to it. The trees began to thin, and the path opened into a wide, high valley she hadn't seen on any map. And there, nestled against the granite shoulder of the mountain, was his home. It was not a cabin. It was a magnificent two-story house built of dark, rich timber and solid gray river stone. A wide porch wrapped around the front, and tall glass windows, an unimaginable luxury, glinted in the late afternoon sun. A massive stone chimney rose from the steeply pitched roof. The house didn't look like it had been built upon the land, but rather that it had grown out of it, a natural and permanent part of the stunning landscape. Sturdy corrals stood nearby, and a well-built barn was set back a ways from the house. It was not the home of a poor man. It was the secluded fortress of a king. Arthur stopped the wagon at the edge of the manicured yard. He did not get down. He did not speak. He simply sat, waiting, the reins held loosely in his hands. He had crossed the river, navigated the wilderness, and brought her to the heart of his secret. He had told her his truth. Now, the next move was hers. She could stay on the wagon, a captive bride brought to a gilded cage, or she could step down and choose to enter this new life with him. She looked at the house, so solid and serene. She looked at the mountains, which stood like silent guardians around the valley. Then she looked at the man beside her. His face was still, his eyes watching her, waiting for her verdict. In them she saw no deception, only a deep and abiding loneliness he hoped she might be willing to share. Slowly, deliberately, Leanne gathered the damp, mud-stained skirts of her white dress. She turned toward him. He immediately understood. He looped the reins and vaulted down from the seat, coming around to her side. He raised his arms, and she placed her hands on his shoulders, allowing him to lift her down. Her feet touched the soft green grass of her new home. She had made her choice. 6 months passed. The vibrant green of summer gave way to the gold of autumn, and then to the deep, quiet white of winter. Snow lay like a thick, soft blanket over the valley, muffling all sound, isolating them completely from the world beyond the river. The town of Redemption Creek was not even a memory. It was a story from another life. Inside the great stone house, a fire roared in the hearth, casting a warm, flickering light across the main room. The house, which had been clean but empty when Leanne first arrived, was now a home. Woven mats she had made from river reeds covered parts of the polished floor. The scent of pine from the fire mingled with the aromas of ginger and herbs from her cooking. On a long windowsill, a row of potted plants, a small piece of her old life she was nurturing in the new, thrived in the winter sunlight. Leanne had learned more English, piecing it together from the books Arthur kept on his shelves, and his patient, quiet instruction. He, in turn, had learned to read her silences, to understand the subtle language of her expressions. Their life was one of shared work and comfortable quiet. He tended to the livestock and the land. She tended to the home and the garden she had carved out of the rich valley soil. They were partners. One evening, as snow fell softly outside the tall windows, Arthur came in from the barn, stamping the cold from his boots. He carried a small, velvet-lined box in his hand. He came to where she sat by the fire, mending one of his shirts. He knelt before her and held out the box. She looked at him, then at the box, and carefully set her sewing aside. She opened it. Inside, nestled on the dark velvet, was a gold ring. It was simple and elegant, a smooth, warm band that seemed to glow in the firelight. Without a word, he took her left hand. He gently slipped the cold, coarse iron ring from her finger. He did not discard it. Instead, he stood and placed it on the heavy wooden mantelpiece above the fire, a small, dark circle against the wood. It was a reminder of their beginning, a testament to the journey they had taken from that dusty office. He returned to her and took her hand again. He slid the gold band onto her finger. It fit perfectly. "This was my mother's," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It belongs here now, with you." Leanne looked down at the beautiful ring, then up at her husband's face. The harsh lines carved by sun and solitude had softened over the months. The watchfulness in his eyes had been replaced by a deep and steady warmth. All the English words she had learned were not enough to say what she felt, but she knew she didn't need them. She reached up and touched his weathered cheek, her small hand against his skin. She looked into his eyes and gave him the one word that meant everything. "Home," she said. It was enough. Some fortunes were not measured in gold or land, but in the quiet, protected world, two people could build together, far from the noise and judgment of others. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.